So today's topic is events. So we're going to learn how to implement keyboard events and mouse events, and eventually action events, which are events from graphical user interface items into our programs. And it kind of combines two topics that we've already discussed, threading and inheritance. So I'm going to back up a step. I'm going to go back to inheritance. I'm going to create myself a JFrame program. So remember from the inheritance video that hopefully you watched, you add import. Basically, when you do extends JFrame, you're copying everything from that JFrame class into your program. So right now we have all access to the variables and functions inside JFrame. In fact, we can start using them. If you want to see a list of them, you can look at the Java API, or you could say this dot and see a list of them. The ones that we're going to do is we're going to say set title, my project. We're going to set the size. And then by default, frames are not visible at the start, so we will set it visible to true. Sometimes you want to run the program but not have it appear right away. And this is also a good way, a good tip to start distinguishing between using functions that you've inherited and functions that you've written yourself. And if you go this dot, it becomes clear that you're using something you've inherited, even though this is still correct. That will still work because it's like that set title function has been copied and pasted in here and you can still use it. But if you go this dot, you'll be able to see which ones you inherited and which ones you actually wrote yourself. But if I run this program right now, you'll see I have my basic frame of a package that I can resize that I have running, which is where we basically started from last year. Last year we would create those JFrame files and NetBeans would do all this code for us. And we can also set this dot resizable to false if we don't want the user to be able to resize our program. So if I kill it, run it again, now you notice I can't resize it. The other thing we did last year is we overrode the paint method. So basically, and we have to add an import for the graphics object. Basically, we said, yeah, we're going to inherit from JFrame, the JFrame class, but we are going to decide how it paints on screen. So if I run it right now, it's giving me a white background. It could give me a clear background or do some weird things depending on what operating system you're running it on. But we can go g.setColor. Oh, and I have to add an import for the color. And hopefully this is a little trip back down memory lane from last year. This is what you were basically doing, right? A lot of this code was generated by NetBeans for you, but now you have the ability to write it yourself and you understand what's actually going on. So we've inherited from JFrame, we created a JFrame project, we created our frame, and we overrode how the paint works, and now we've got a red background. Now, a little history. If I was doing this in C++, I could inherit from multiple classes by going comma, and then adding another class name here, and I could inherit from multiple classes, and so all that stuff would end up in my project. The developers of Java found that programs written that way would get convoluted, would be tough to follow, to see where functions were coming from what classes. made the code a little more complicated. They wanted to simplify everything, so they did single inheritance. So you couldn't inherit from multiple classes. You would have one single line of inheritance into your class. If you want to inherit from multiple classes, what you would have to do is you would have to write your own JFrame class that inherited from the other class that you wanted to write from, and then you could inherit from that one that inherited from the other one, right? Uh, kind of like 3 generations of dog. If you wanted to do a dog class, you could have generation 1 dog, have generation 2 dog, inherit from dog 1, and then have dog 3rd generation dog inherit from dog 2, which would actually inherit from the other 2. So they found that they wanted to simplify code a little bit, and that's why they did single inheritance. It becomes a problem when we want our program to do multiple things. So right now I would like to inherit from a class that's going to help me get keyboard events or mouse events into my program. Now we'll take a step back, and actually, now that we've done threading, we should hopefully understand the basics of what's happening when you're listening for keyboard events. What's actually happening is you've created a new thread of execution in your program, and that thread, the only job of that thread is to listen to the operating system for when the operating system tells you that a keyboard event has happened, whether somebody's pressed a key while they were using your program, or the mouse has moved over your program, or somebody clicked the mouse on your program. So the operating system listens for those events from the hardware, and then it passes it to the thread that you've created in your program to listen for when these keyboard events happen. So the messaging goes from the hardware to the operating system to your program. So basically, we need to start a thread that's going to listen for keyboard events or mouse events or whatever else we want to do. Now, in order to do multiple inheritance, they had to add a workaround for that issue to do keyboard events and mouse events. They added this implements keyword. So you're not actually inheriting from a class, you're implementing a interface, which is, basically the same thing. So I'm going to say implements key listener. And I'm going to have to add an import for a key listener, and then the import pops up at the top. If I go, it says input is not abstract. The difference between inheriting from a class directly and implementing a interface is that you're making a deal that when you inherit from this key listener function, you're going to override, or sorry, key listener class, you're going to override certain functions. And the functions that you're going to override are key pressed, key typed, key released. You'll notice as soon as I paste those in, I'm going to have to add an import for those. And then I leave it to you to figure out what each of those does if you want to look at the reading, or you can actually do a series of system.outs just like we did last year, try and figure out what's happening when these events are triggered by the operating system. System.out.press. Now, last thing we have to do, if I run this program, it's still not going to listen for keyboard events. In order to do that, we actually have to start the thread to listen for keyboard events, because sometimes we don't want it listening right from the start. So we could say add key listener this, which actually starts our thread that's going to listen for your keyboard events. Let me kill the old program. Run it. So I've got my program running. Now I'll press a key. Notice key pressed, and every time I press a key, that pops up. So now, when we do implements, basically the terminology here is it's an interface, which is it's the same thing as inheriting from a class, except you're making the deal that you have to override some certain functions. I could actually do JFrame if I wanted to, if there was an interface for JFrame where I would say you have to use, and if you implement the JFrame interface, you have to override paint. So you have to decide how your program's going to draw on screen. So that's the deal with interfaces and multiple inheritance. Now we could use that to inherit or implement multiple interfaces. So we're going to say mouse listener next. Okay, and same thing as before. It's not abstract because it's an interface. We have to override certain functions. And I'm going to paste those in right here. So we have mouse pressed, mouse released, mouse entered, mouse exited. I'm going to add my import. Again, I leave it to you. At this point, you should be able to do a system.out or do the reading and figure out what each of these, when each of these is triggered. Just like before, I have to start my mouse listener thread by doing okay, kill the old program. Okay, and hopefully you could crack the code. So if I press a key pressed, if I move the mouse out of my program, it does mouse exited. So hopefully you can figure out what mouse exited and mouse entered do now, and you can add some other system.outs to figure out how to do the rest of these. And then soon you'll see when we start doing graphical user interfaces, when we do buttons and text boxes, it's implemented the same way, except it's using an action listener instead of a key listener or a mouse listener.